This is Think Out Loud on OPB. I'm Dave Miller. Scientists at the Cascadia Research Collective have never seen so many gray whales off the Washington coast dying this early in the year. So far this year, 14 have been found off the coast of Washington and 3 more off the Oregon coast. John Kalambokidis has been studying gray whales for over 50 years. He's a co-founder and senior research biologist at the Cascadia Research Collective in Olympia, and he joins us now. It's great to have you on Think Out Loud.
Yeah, nice to talk to you.
So I mentioned this number. More than a dozen gray whales have been found dead along the Washington coast, more off the Oregon coast since the beginning of 2026. How different is that from a recent year?
Yes, well, we've been in a period of elevated mortality starting in 2019 and start of what NOAA declared an unusual mortality event. And we have had higher totals than we are at right now. But the troubling thing about the number we're at is how early they've come and in what a rapid rate they've been coming. And it's also very troubling that this is now 6-7 years into this mortality event. And while we've seen some of these events in the past, they've usually been short term and the whales have bounced back. And instead, we're seeing this continued number of mortalities with some other really troubling signs as well.
I want to hear more about those broader issues you're talking about, but to just hear a little bit about the specifics here. You're one of the people that responds to a whale stranding or a whale being found washed up on a shore. What happens when you arrive? What are you doing?
Yes, and we're part of the Pacific Northwest Marine Mammal Stranding Network. It's managed and authorized by NOAA, and there are, different participants in different areas, Portland State University and Oregon State University in Oregon. And so we usually get notified from a number of different sources that there's a whale washing up. It might be through NOAA or a report directly to us or from the Coast Guard. And then our initial focus is some really basic information. What species is it? How big is it? What age class? What sex? And then depending on the condition of the animal, and we also have to start bringing in considerations like how public is this? What are going to be the disposal issues in terms of what we can do with the whale? But our hope, if the whale is fresh enough, is to collect both external and internal tissues that can be looked at in more detail later and tell us important things like contaminants and amount of lipids, but also look for signs of things like ship strike, entanglement, other major causes of death like that are human related. If we can go deeper, we can look at stomach contents. Was this whale feeding? Or not, any indications from the different organs of any pathologies. So you kind of have a level we can go down. Right now, our examination team is pretty heavily taxed because these strandings have been coming at a rate of, one every day or every other day for the last couple of weeks.
Have any patterns emerged in terms of what these whales look like or what it seems has happened to them?
Yes, absolutely. Some of them consistent with past years. And I'd say the consistent feature is a lot of the whales are really malnourished. And that's been a pattern, going back, through this mortality event and even some of the previous ones. And that can be a little bit tricky just because these are whales right now that are northbound coming from their breeding areas in Mexico, headed back to their feeding areas, and their main feeding area is in the Arctic. And so they've typically gone through, even under normal times, a 3 to 4 month fast. So it's usually when they're normally in their worst body condition. But some of these animals, are in extremely poor body condition. Like we've had cases where even though they have a blubber layer, we'll test the blubber layer, and you think of blubber as being fat and oil, but there'll be less than 5% lipids or oil in that blubber. It'll mostly be just dry tissue or sometimes watery tissue without oil in it. So that's one characteristic that's common. This year in particular, we've been seeing almost all of our animals as adult males. We don't know if that will hold up. Kind of historically, there's a slight male skew to the whales we tend to find dead, but nothing as dramatic as we're seeing this year. We don't know if that will hold up. You know, on the adult class size, uh, that makes a little bit of sense because one of the other pieces of information we've seen is coming from the NOAA counts of the population is that the number of calves born in recent years, and especially last year, was at the lowest level they had ever documented. So part of the troubling part is there are just not a lot of juvenile animals in the population. And typically, historically, we've seen, a significant component of these strandings being juvenile animals, and we're not seeing that this year.
How does whale behavior change when they are severely malnourished?
Well, the big thing that we're seeing is whales showing up in unusual areas. This was most dramatic with a whale that swam up a small river a couple of weeks ago, the Willapa River, a river we didn't think a whale could swim up. Uh, and what we view as these are whales that are trying to explore and are maybe in a desperate search for feeding, and that could be because they're running through their reserves that they've stored up. So some of these whales that are starving, it's really a reflection of how much food did they eat and nutrition did they get last year. And if they're running through those reserves, they're in a maybe more desperate search for new areas or don't even have the ability to swim back to their main feeding grounds in the Arctic. But we also see, and this is a little more tragic, a certain level of debilitation kick in and that's why we think sometimes these whales end up rivers or other areas, and some of these whales we've encountered at these kind of later stages, don't seem like they're entirely there.
These are the whales that humans can easily see. They're washing up on shore or they're going weirdly, up a river. But do you have a sense for the mortality level that's not visible, that where whales would just be dying in the open ocean?
That is a great question, and I'm really glad you asked me that because we think that's a much bigger portion of the mortality than the portion we see. And especially with these emaciated whales where they don't have much oil or fat, they are actually negatively buoyant. So when they do
Meaning they
die,
sink.
they will sink. And if they sink in shallow enough water, there might be bloating that will occur later that might bring them up, but they either stay on the bottom, and sometimes this is referred to, and you've maybe seen stories about whale falls, where in certain areas you can find these carcasses on the bottom that end up feeding a whole benthic community, ends up living around these decomposing whales on the bottom. But we think it might be 70, 80% of the mortality goes undiscovered that way. And that seems to match. Uh, there are these annual censuses of the gray whale population, and this is one other piece of the puzzle that are done in California by NOAA. And those are what are used to estimate the overall gray whale population. And in the last 10 years, those have shown a decline from a high of 27,000 down to their most recent estimate last year of 13,000. So that's to less than half in less than 10 years. And that's a really precipitous decline. And if you look at the overall pattern of these population estimates, they do seem to drop during these periods of elevated mortalities. But whereas we might be discovering hundreds of animals on shore, the population estimate drops by thousands, matching that point that you were asking about, that the majority of the mortalities actually go undocumented.
I want to hear more about that in just a second, but you mentioned earlier questions about disposal. Famously in Oregon, in Florence, in 1970, officials used dynamite to theoretically dispose of a whale carcass that had washed up on shore. Chunks of blubber rained down. It's become a kind of part of kooky Oregon lore. But if we're talking about higher than ever numbers earlier in the season of whales on shore. How do you manage disposal when if they're coming, every couple days?
Yes, and I think that is posing a major challenge, and especially there's some of these whales that come into the Salish Sea and Puget Sound into much more populated areas, and that becomes a bigger issue. So it sort of has to be figured out individually. The preferred and first method we like to look to is to allow the whale to decompose naturally. And in more remote areas, that's feasible and that's the preferred option. The next most common option is to maybe use heavy equipment to drag it a little bit higher up the beach and bury it. So that's an option. In areas that are really populated or not sandy areas, sometimes we look to tow them to a more remote location or even sink them with weights so that they stay on the bottom. And those are all the more common things, but there can be really unusual things and unusual places these whales end up, from uprivers to a whale that got stuck in a pier. Uh, you know, Maybe I'll tell one odd story. NOAA
Please.
actually has a program where they sought uh, coastal shoreline property owners if they would want to volunteer their property to have a whale towed and decompose on their beach. And we've actually had one whale do that. They have had a number of people step up and do this, and found it fascinating to watch over the few months that the whale would decompose on the beach. So there are actually some people that are fascinated, by this. So
What does a decomposing whale smell like?
Um, well, I think those of us that work a lot with dead whales have maybe become a little more resistant. And, I'll think a whale doesn't smell that bad and is pretty fresh. And I'll see other people not used to it,
Not wanting to be
gag,
around you?
yeah, gagging, and the reaction to it can be, highly varied. My son, who used to assist me in necropsies many years ago, he's an older adult now. It was interesting. He loved helping with these necropsies and didn't notice the smell. And then it was something like at 12 or 13 years old. It's like one day while doing it, he stopped and he said, "Wait a minute, this really stinks." Like it had connected with some part of his brain. I don't want to do this anymore. But not to make light of it. It can smell, fairly bad, but there are ways to kind of mitigate that. It kind of gets worse initially, but then it gets better kind of over time. Uh,
Well,
and
to go back to the really serious piece here, you mentioned a more than 50% drop in overall estimated gray whale populations off the northern Pacific coast in a couple decades. What are the leading theories for what's behind this continuing population decline?
Yes, and this is maybe a good chance to contrast them to some of the other kind of gray whale populations, because that's what really reveals what's causing this one. For example, there's a group of gray whales that feeds in the Pacific Northwest called the Pacific Coast Feeding Aggregation. So whale watching in the summer off of Depot Bay or Newport often goes out to see these gray whales that are feeding actually in Oregon coastal waters. Uh, those represent a small portion of the population, just about 250 whales do that. And that group does not just seem to be experiencing this big die-off and these big vacillations. There's another group of gray whales that feeds in called the Western gray whale population off the coast of Russia. It seems to be doing okay. So everything points the finger at the Arctic feeding grounds, which is where most of the overall population goes to feed, because that's the component of the population showing this high mortality. Unfortunately, it's the biggest component. Uh, and for a while, we thought, okay, gray whales represented a success story. They had actually bounced back from just a few thousand up to over 20,000. And for a while, we thought this was a success story of a recovery of a whale population. But we knew they would probably hit a food limited carrying capacity. And sure enough, starting in the 1990s, we started to see increased mortality, these more kind of, in one paper that we worked on together with a number of co-authors, these boom bust cycles in gray whales that maybe indicated they had reached the limit of that food supply. And in the early years of this most recent mortality event, we thought, okay, maybe this just is another one of those cycles. But all those other events lasted just a year or two, after which the whales rebounded back to their original level. What's troubling about this one is we're not seeing that rebound. The decline is to lower levels than they've been in 50 years, and it's clearly part of a larger trend. And the Arctic ecosystem where gray whales feed is, part of that ecosystem that used to be covered by ice, and the ice would retreat, was part of a dynamic system involving ice cover that has dramatically changed with global warming and climate change. And so, we have a pretty good idea that's at the heart of this, but some of the finer mechanisms of how that's causing that decline, like there are elements of lower ice that actually have a short-term benefit to gray whales. They can access more areas, and we've seen them expand their feeding areas in the Arctic with less ice. But it also seems to be really damaging the ecosystem, and especially some of the benthic productivity that the gray whales rely on to feed on these small creatures on the bottom.
John Kalambokidis, thanks very much.
Great to talk to you.
John Kalambokidis is a scientist, a co-founder of the Cascadia Research Collective. He has been studying gray whales for over 50 years.